Psychedelic is a skill set. It's a bit like shooting a mystical free throw.
Today we have Dr. Ben Malcolm, whose work stands at the intersection of science, spirituality, and personal transformation. He's a clinically trained psychiatric pharmacist. He's known as the spirit pharmacist. Dr. Malcolm empowers individuals to explore these powerful medicines responsibly via his clinical consulting, online courses. If you're interested, go to spiritpharmacist.com.
Why is it that if we take some of these substances and push on the serotonin to a receptor in the person's brain, and I have them in a safe environment that they're comfortable, that maybe has some spiritual or religious themes to it, I go through an experience and I miss it, and I let the fear get the best of me.
Welcome to Noble Warrior. My name is CK Lin. This is where I interview entrepreneurs, practitioners about how they move from finite games to infinite games in pursuit of life of greater purpose and joy. Today we have Dr. Ben Malcolm, whose work stands at the intersection of science, spirituality, and personal transformation. He's a clinically trained psychiatric pharmacist, known as the spirit pharmacist. Dr. Malcolm empowers individuals to explore these powerful medicines responsibly via his clinical consulting, online courses. If you're interested, go to spiritpharmacist.com. Welcome to Noble Warrior, Ben.
It's really wonderful to be here, CK. Thanks for having me.
So let me start off by asking you about your didgeridoo, because that's the first time I heard you and said to myself, I'm going to talk to this man. He's super interesting. How long have you been playing the didgeridoo, and have you been playing since we met?
Yeah, so I started playing around the age of 18 is when I really bought a didgeridoo and learned circular breathing with it. And it's a bit on and off, to be honest. There are times where I really play pretty intensively for some period and I have the space in my life. And then there's times where it goes up on the shelf and there's other things that are preoccupying me for some period. But it's always been a part of my life that I keep coming back to over and over again. And I really do feel that the didgeridoo was instrumental in kind of awakening me to spirituality in generally, and then the kinds of brands of spirituality that really kind of jived or resonated with me overall. Is just a wonderful and interesting instrument, and it's ancient. Yeah.
Okay, so I didn't expect this conversation to go here, but didgeridoo and spirituality, tell me a little bit more about it, because I had no idea that was a connection there.
Well, it's from like an indigenous or traditional, like Aboriginal perspective, right? The didgeridoo is probably one of the oldest instruments ever known. They essentially would make them from termite hollowed logs. And it was a big part of their own creation myth or creation stories. The didgeridoo is essentially a storytelling instrument, and they would use it to tell various stories about different animals, about different plants, essentially the time before human existence, which they referred to as the dream time. So the didgeridoo has always been wrapped up in Australian Aboriginal tradition and spirituality. It really feeds into their artwork as well, right? Like they have a specialized form of dot art that they do, and their didgeridoos are oftentimes painted with a specialized form of dot art. They're getting the paints and things for that dot art directly from the land. There's all sorts of cool sorts of red earth tones and different stones in the outback and things like that. So by grinding them and making them into essentially rock pastes and things like that is how they get those paints. But there's something about the didgeridoo being a woodwind instrument where it's powered by breath. When it comes to thinking about breath and spirituality, there's some big connections there that have been elucidated in a number of different traditions and things for a long period of time. But then there's also something about the breath with the didgeridoo and the fact that it never stops, that it's rhythmic. I don't know. We live in an expanding universe, but will it contract at some point the same way that my lungs expand and contract with each breath? I mean, is the universe just in an expansive breath right now, or on an inhale and the lungs are filling and getting larger from a universal type of angle or perspective? The sort of rhythmic circular breathing is a breathing technique in of itself that if you do it for some period of time, particularly intensively, it will take you to non-ordinary types of states, and you can really enter some deep trances and things like that. Were instrumental because I'd never experienced any of these states until, I was playing didgeridoo for like 10 or 20 minutes straight. And then all of a sudden something else would happen or kind of open up overall. So I think that there's a lot of connections between music and sound and spirituality and human tradition, oral tradition, things like that, storytelling, right, is all wrapped up in indigenous tradition, world music, and the didgeridoo is just one of the most ancient examples out there.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're
As
welcome.
always,
You're welcome. Yeah.
yeah, as always, you're unlocking my brain to think about didgeridoo in a whole different way.
Yeah.
Recently, I've reignited my interest in the didgeridoo. I haven't really touched since our lesson, which was years ago.
Yeah.
So don't ask me about how I'm doing with it. But nonetheless, I'm still seeing or experiencing the connection between chi, prana, and how we move it, because healing is moving energy, and then how you move the chi is quite comparable to how you move certain energy, within your body. So I was reignited with my interest in the didgeridoo. So seeing the background, that's what I wanted to ask you, but I didn't really think about anything beyond just the chi. Now that you mentioned the rhythmic aspect of it, I think it's really
Yeah.
beautiful. Yeah, thank you so much for opening up
It's a
that.
really primal, guttural type of tone too. So if you wanted to like maybe look at it more from a chakra system or something like that, I really think it's the sacral, lower, guttural sorts of bowel area chakras that the traditional didgeridoo drones are hitting. You can blow overtones or toots, which really do. If you sit there with your eyes closed, you will be able to feel these sounds resonating different centers within your body overall. So I think that there's something about the didgeridoo that tends to cut and go deep because it is guttural and somatic and visceral as far as the bass tone. And this creates a situation where about 90% of people really love didgeridoo because it's this really novel sound that they're not used to hearing, and it's not the most common instrument. And then there's 10% of people where it just grates them and they're like, stop. And it probably is because it triggers or activates these deeper areas that some people enjoy going to as a place. And then some persons, it's quite awkward and uncomfortable.
I think this may be a good segue, because I'm both people that you mentioned. There are times when I really love it, and there are times that I'm like, oh my gosh, get this thing out of my ears, please. It's similar to the buffalo drum, super bassy, and then sometimes I love it. But now that you mentioned the other side of it, the grading aspect of it, I just, I can't take this, it's too much.
Yeah.
So have you ever experienced that for you yourself personally, being on both sides?
Yeah, it's going to be hard to play a didgeridoo in a way that I don't like or appreciate. I meet a lot of people that are beginning their journey with didgeridoo, and maybe they're hearing other persons that have been playing for a long period of time, and they're thinking, well, compared to that person, I suck, and an advanced didgeridoo player wouldn't even enjoy listening to me. And it's like, if you can blow a drone, I enjoy listening to it. There's really not a lot of, oh,
Uh,
that's bad didgeridoo or that's good didgeridoo for me overall. But, are there certain instruments or certain times, or less with like music and instruments, but certain times in ceremony or certain times during psychedelic states or non-ordinary states where, probably the majority of the time I'm really either enjoying where I'm at or appreciating it in some way, even if it's not necessarily euphoric or pleasurable. But every now and again, something happens that grates against you overall, and it is awkward, and it is part of learning how to deal with uncomfortable stimulus. I think it's one of the really helpful things that psychedelics can do for us, is put us in uncomfortable or difficult situations with our emotions or our consciousness, and allow ourselves to work some stuff out there, or to sit with the discomfort long enough to sort of almost see it as a false panic signal, a fake type of thing. Okay, someone's beating a buffalo drum and the rhythm got fast all of a sudden, and that gentle drumming heart rate now feels like a pounding heart.
mhm,
And that increases some fear or anxiety in some ways because my heart wants to match the tone or the rhythm of what's happening. All right,
mhm,
so now I'm in this state where maybe there's some level of sympathetic arousal, but I am in control of my breathing, and I can use the parasympathetic long breath technique to actually take that heart rate down, or start noticing how my breath responded to the change in rhythm. So these moments that are uncomfortable are oftentimes, at least in my opinion, like opportunities to learn about a mind body connection, and maybe either sit with discomfort, panic, and fear long enough that you go through the other side and just reach usually a heavenly state if you really sit with it and get through it, or just different ways of interacting with discomfort or emotion that is different than oh my God, my heart's racing, get the benzodiazepine. Like, all right, there's got to be some other ways that I can navigate this uncomfortable state that I'm in, where there might be some level of autonomic arousal that makes relaxing harder than usual, but not impossible.
Yeah. Speaking like a psychedelic veteran, I
Yeah,
think your
go ahead.
mindset is very much of someone who's been through it, who has maybe gone through different phases of like, oh, it's not so bad. It's similar to exposure therapy, right? So after you
Yeah.
experience it, it's not too bad, and you experience the euphoric or the learnings or the
Yeah.
insight.
Or there's just been times where it's like I go through an experience and I miss it, and I let the fear get the best of me, and there's some level of resistance there. And then looking back, I can kind of see those moments where there was fear or resistance, and then there's going to be an opportunity next time. And there's been times where those moments have come, and I've interacted differently, and it has vastly changed the outcome of what I feel and experience during the trip or the journey in a way that has really kind of convinced me that navigating the psychedelic is a skill set. It's a bit like shooting a mystical free throw. It's not the toughest shot in the world to make overall, but even professionals miss free throws fairly regularly, to be honest with you. I think most of the time a person takes a shot and it hits the backboard and rolls around the rim and they get something good out of that, but it's not necessarily just a mystical swoosh, so to speak. There's nothing wrong with taking a shot from the free throw line and missing a free throw. You just get the ball and go back to the free throw line and practice again and take another shot. Whereas I think a lot of time, this kind of like, well, I ran into resistance, or my guide thinks I ran into resistance, but I had a hard time even seeing the resistance is probably a little bit more common scenario for the sort of first or second time overall. And it's oftentimes concluded from this that like, I didn't do it right, and that's why it turned out wrong, like overall. And it's, well, you shot a free throw and it didn't go in, but it doesn't mean that your free throw technique was poor or that it wasn't a good shot overall. It just means that sometimes in life you have to practice something a few times before you get the hang of it or get a skill set overall. And so I'm actually incredibly impressed with the ability in clinical trials to achieve a mystical experience on the first occasion, because I think in my consulting practice, I feel that it is oftentimes a bit of a learning curve the first time, and it's really subsequent experiences where the mystical effects tend to be more prominent or accessed more deeply overall.
So there's a phrase in Chinese, essentially says that if you're young and you receive good fortune, it's not a blessing, it's a curse. So I was like, oh, in my younger days, I didn't quite appreciate it. Now that I'm a little bit older, I can appreciate the wisdom of that. And so I had the good fortune. Within 45 minutes, I had my first experience and it was mystical. Like I
Yeah.
was out of this world. And that really drew me to explore this beautiful path, spiritual and inner world and emotionality and all of it. So I'm very, very thankful for that mystical experience. Do you think it's a blessing or a curse to have mystical experiences early?
Oh, I think anytime a mystical experience comes to you, it's a blessing. There is one facilitator that we both know that likes to read some mystical poetry and things at that time. And I forget if this one's a Rumi one or a Hafiz one. And I'm going to butcher it and paraphrase a little bit right now. But essentially, it goes something along the lines of, when the ocean comes to you, marry at once. Do not question whether the ocean has come to you or what its reason is for coming to you. It's just anytime the ocean comes to you and wants to marry, you marry immediately because it is inviting you to a true mystical experience. Or there's another verse in maybe the same poem or a different poem. It's meaning a very similar thing. And it's something along the lines of, a perfect falcon has landed on your shoulder for no particular reason. And so it's basically like these experiences are almost always incredible gifts. Like the idea of, well, if I got a mystical experience the first time, that might not be as fortunate as if I had to do it 5 or 6 times to like get there. I think that there's wisdom in what you're saying, right? Because I think sometimes I meet younger persons that have had serious health challenges early in life, and if they beat those challenges, it's given them this level of resilience and wisdom that is just beyond where their peers are as far as development, because they experience the hardships and losses that most people don't get to until their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s in their late teens or early 20s. And so oftentimes there's a period where my life was removed from me. Like I didn't get to do the normal, like sorts of peer development types of things. And there's oftentimes like trauma and hardship associated with that. But there's also this idea of resilience or post-traumatic growth. And if a person maybe undergoes those kinds of hardships and actually gets into that post-traumatic growth phase or has the resilience to make it through those things, then it probably sets them up for being able to deal with the hardships later in life a lot more effectively and not have to go through those things then. Whereas maybe, your life's incredibly privileged, there's very little trauma or adverse childhood experiences. So maybe on the one hand, superficially, you're intact, but by the time you get to your 30s, 40s, 50s, and then some true hardship comes down the pike, you may not have the emotional skill sets to deal with it as effectively as the person that had that a little bit earlier overall. So, yeah, I think that there are a lot of phrases like this where, there are certain circumstances where I think that there's a ton of wisdom and I would readily apply them. And then, the first time mystical experience with psychedelics, I'm thinking like more along the lines of that's just always a gift. Yeah.
So, which is a good segue to your expertise. You think understanding pharmacology of psychedelic interactions enhances or diminishes your experience? Now, let me quantify that a little bit because I meet
Yeah.
musicians who is masters of the mechanics of putting beautiful music together. Often for them, it's really hard to enjoy the music because they're hearing all the little techniques. This is missing,
Yeah.
that's this and that and the other thing.
Yeah.
So for you, as someone who understands how the pharmacological interaction of these compounds in the body, one assumes, correct me if I'm wrong, it's easy to get into the molecules, the chemical bonds and things like that versus just experience the phenomenology of it all. I'm not you, so
Yeah.
curious to know how you think of it.
Well, I do think that drug interaction and pharmacology really matter in all of this, right? I think that psychedelics are essentially special types of substances or maybe a special category of drugs, but they're not special from other drugs in the sense that, well, they have a mechanism, they have a pharmacology to them, they have a metabolism, they have the potential to interact with certain things in the way that could maybe diminish some of the subjective effects, maybe potentiate some of the physical effects, or even worse, potentiate some physical adverse kind of reaction, like overall. So I do think at baseline, the drug interactions really do matter, particularly with psychiatric medications that do affect the brain. And I think serotonin and GABA types of neurotransmitter systems are the types of psychiatric drugs that are kind of on the top of the list for being able to change or influence or otherwise modulate psychedelic experiences. But I think to your point, oftentimes I do get questions about drugs where there really isn't much data or information. And a lot of the time it's a non-psychoactive type of thing where I'm really thinking the chances of a significant drug interaction are pretty low. And then other times it is a more CNS active type of medication where it probably almost for sure changes some aspect of what the person thinks or feels or how they show up at baseline, right? So I think I'm probably one of the most guilty persons in the world of this. I have these sweet little charts that reductionistically take things down to a level of, okay, well, if you mix this psychedelic with this drug, you might get potentiated psychological effects or potentiated physical effects or diminished physical effects or psychological effects. But I think a lot of the times it's more of a modulated effect. It's more of a sideways effect. Like if we're thinking of the psychedelic as a mind manifesting experience, then whatever sorts of drugs or whatever sorts of filters that the person has in place at baseline is essentially the foundation for their mind manifested type of experience. So I think oftentimes the relationship the person has to the substance is probably just as important or maybe more important in some examples than the drug interaction itself. So for example, if I had a person with an advanced cancer and they had started some morphine recently and maybe there is a little bit of a side effect, like it causes some constipation or something, but it's got their pain so much better under control than it was previously. And it really is a strictly therapeutic kind of relationship that they have with the opioid or morphine. So, am I going to spend a lot of time telling them about how sedatives could kind of tank their experience in some way, or maybe they won't get the most out of it? It's like, I'm in planning and feeding a lot of negative suggestion at that point that is just not really evidence-based overall. And I don't really want these thoughts rattling around in a person's head around, well, if I took an extended release morphine to manage my cancer pain this morning, it means that I ruined my day or that I'm not going to get the experience that I want to. Sometimes even when I think that the experience is modulated, if I can't clearly tell a person how it's modulated or the direction that it's modulated in, I essentially almost leave those parts out of the conversation because I don't want to, yeah, from the perspective of hypnotic suggestion or something, all
Yeah.
of a sudden in a preparation session, start talking about how all of these unanswered theoreticals about how these drugs you're taking might change this. You're essentially getting their analytical mind all worked up about stuff that, okay, it's not dangerous to do it. And why don't we just do it and see what comes instead of telling you all of these things that aren't very clear overall that might actually start to impact your psychology in a serious way that probably affects the experience more than the pharmacology of the drug interaction really did. So with ayahuasca, I talk about this like really in detail, but any psychedelic you could think about it is there's probably some drugs out there that are relatively benign and there's very little interaction potential between them. And maybe that's just fine to combine overall, or good to combine might be a way of thinking about it. And then there are drugs that there's a
So
definitive
is
kind of drug
psychedelic,
interaction there.
is ayahuasca one of them?
What do you mean? Ayahuasca, combine it with something? I talk about this with ayahuasca because I think the stakes around drug interaction are higher because it has small amine oxidase inhibitors in it. So I think that there's
I
more
see.
drugs with ayahuasca which are just clearly contraindicated from a safety
Got it.
angle,
Got it.
right? There's some things I would consider compatible. There's some things that the list is longer with ayahuasca, things I consider incompatible or bad type of drug interaction. But then everything else boils down to what I call the soul as far as an interaction. Because when a person uses different substances, it creates a certain type of psychology. They have a relationship with that substance overall. And particularly with controlled substances, you run into a real range of relationships and sets of feelings out there. There's many people I talk to that are sparingly using some low dose cannabinoid gummy at night, oftentimes as an alternative to what I would consider a more hardcore kind of hypnotic or sleep aid overall. And I'm just feeling like this is probably a good trade-off compared to alternative types of medications. It really doesn't seem wild and out of control. The doses that you're taking are still in the realm of entry-level doses of Delta. I was going to prescribe like something like that, like overall. So do we need to stop that for weeks ahead of this journey experience and make a big deal about an interaction? No, I really don't think so. You get people that are on the other end of the spectrum. I have complex PTSD and I am smoking 3 grams of cannabis a day and I'm feeling all reactive and emotionally dysregulated. And I want to use MDMA to get to the childhood trauma. And do you think it's all right to smoke a lot of weed before my experience and then during the experience if something kind of nerve wracking comes up? It's like, I believe that this person has a maladaptive relationship to cannabis and they're probably overusing it at baseline. And while there might be some short term immediate symptomatic relief, it's probably not leading to a more emotionally regulated or healthier psychological state overall. And so does that mean that abstinence is the answer forever and ever? Probably not. I think that there's a lot of harm reduction approaches to addiction or substance use patterns that are maladaptive that we can take in between, but it really might be what the person needs to do for some period of time before these types of experiences or ceremonies, just to simply be able to access those childhood memories and like strip down some of the anxiety to a bit more of a raw, naked state where we might be able to just get closer to the root of things overall. So there's essentially, particularly with controlled substances, what's the interaction between controlled substance X and psychedelic Y? My first question always is, what's the person's relationship to controlled substance X? Before I start thinking about how it interacts with whatever psychedelic, what's the relationship? Because low
Mm.
dose stimulant user for ADHD, not thinking there's a whole lot of problem there. May still need to take a few days off for MAOI containing psychedelics like ayahuasca for truly for safety reasons. I have a methamphetamine use disorder. I smoke speed and stay awake for 3 or 4 days at a time and crash out for 48 hours. Can I go, use some ayahuasca at this weekend ceremony? I promise I won't use it for 6 hours ahead of time. It's like,
Mm.
wow, that person has a very serious problem. they're probably in a almost psychotic or paranoid state by the time that they're done with that bender overall. And I would have serious reservations about whether they really can even abstain for a length of time without
Mhm.
support or a detox to safely be able to do that kind of thing. Right.
Yeah.
So there is drug interaction that's real. There's drug interaction that probably is real, but it's very soft and speculative. We don't have clear enough information to really say much about it because I don't want to just artificially color a person's experiences in ways that really well thought out overall or apparent. And then there's a lot I think a person thinks about as far as what is my own relationship to these substances that I'm taking in my life? Are they helpful to me? Is it a mixed blessing where there's some help and some side effect or some downside to it? Or is it really sort of a broken relationship that absolutely needs changed and addressed, whether there is a drug interaction there or not? Because it's just part of their healing or transformation to address those things.
I really appreciate how you answered this question. It's very thoughtful, very humane, you know.
I think
Because
about it occasionally.
yeah, because the way, I mean, not being a pharmacist at all, the way I would probably answer it just straight, right? Hey, here's contraindication of this and that. But you made it much more personal. What's your relationship with this
Yeah.
substance? And then you think about the interaction, so on and so on. So I
Yeah.
really appreciate that. Yeah, it's thoughtful of
Yeah.
you.
I mean, there are some interactions that are black and white. You can just answer it on a black and white level. But most things is kind of like, what about antidepressant Y? And it's like, what about it? What about the person that's attached to it, the illnesses that they have, how long they've been taking it, whether it works well for them or not, are is in a season of their life where they truly want to attempt to taper in some alternative therapy, or if they're just looking for a spiritual experience that could be compatible with the antidepressant that they're currently taking. Like all of those things matter a whole lot. So it's clinical medicine is about evaluating a person. That's
Yeah.
what clinical medicine's about. It's not evaluating drug interaction in a vacuum. And so there are examples that are clear enough that you can answer based on a vacuum, but they're the minority of examples, actually. Uh,
Yeah, that's really cool. I may have some people to refer to. So that wasn't actually the original question. The original question is maybe let me give you a little
yeah,
context, a little bit more. So I was talking to Dr. Bruce Damer. He coined a phrase, psychedelic assisted innovation. And then why and how he got into it is he's a astrobiologist. He basically studies how life got started. So he was keen on training his mind, priming his mind about, all right, so we have these compounds at these temperatures and the cycle of volcanoes and what happens. And then he would just imagine in his mind, creating a mental movie effectively, how these molecules interact with each other during the different temperature cycles and so on. And then doing a low dose ayahuasca experience, he played those movies time and again. And then before the ceremony, and then he just let it go and let it roll, right? Doing ceremony and see what happens. I'm saying all that is
yeah.
you as someone who understand the pharmacological interaction of these drugs. The question was understanding these pharmacology of these molecules. Does that enhance your spiritual experience, personal development experience during ceremony, or does it detracts from it because you understand the mechanics how these things interact?
I don't know if it enhances or detracts. I would say it leans towards enhances more than detracts. I really don't feel that knowing about the pharmacology of the substances has in any way diminished the quality of the experience or the effects. I think that it's actually, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and say it enhances the experience more than it even neutral or that it detracts because I think there are some bigger, more spiritual sorts of unanswered questions about psychedelics and psychedelic biology overall. For example, why is it that if we take some of these substances and just push on a serotonin to a receptor in the person's brain, and I have them in a safe environment that they're comfortable, that maybe has some spiritual or religious themes to it, why is it that I can engender a bona fide mystical experience or a bona fide religious experience, a really high percentage of the time overall? I don't think it's a freak accident that our minds and bodies are built this way. I think that there is a purpose, an evolutionary design to these types of experiences. And there's stoned ape theories, right, about how psychedelics may have actually helped to develop the sort of newly evolved prefrontal cortex that essentially seems to make human consciousness what it is, with abstract reasoning, executive function planning, et cetera, the sort of conscious awareness piece of it. So why is it then? Is spirituality a flaw in the biology of a human? I don't think so. A human needs a story. It seems like we need a storyline to explain who we are, where we come from, where we're going to, perhaps. And that seems like a really important part to allow a human to have hope in difficult sorts of circumstances. So I think that when we look at psychedelics, it seems that they catalyze transformation. It's one way of looking at it. Or maybe activate dynamic sorts of coping mechanisms overall. The sort of coping mechanisms that probably aren't accessed regularly in the organism's normal natural life that doesn't involve ingesting psychedelics. It's probably a type of experience that occurs once or twice in the organism's life, oftentimes where there's a lot of extreme pressure or they've sort of really reached a dead end in some way. So I sort of think about the idea of a rock bottom experience associated with addiction, essentially a change or bust. I get lower and lower and lower, just keep going, right? Passive coping. And I get to this inflection point where all of a sudden, maybe something spiritual sort of happens and I have this realization. And then all of a sudden I have to switch directions and go on a different path. So I think most of the time the organism wants to in this passive coping type of zone. Change is hard for the organism. It doesn't want to do it. It's habitually entrained to do its continuous sort of routine. But every now and again, biology needs this sort of change or bust mechanism. And I think when the pressures of life come in, it oftentimes can open these types of spiritual experience, or maybe even manic or psychotic kinds of breaks. And spiritual emergence is another, I think, in the ballpark of what we're talking about here. You need an evolutionary change mechanism associated with mystical experiences. And I think that's what the underlying design is. And whether it came about from humans interacting with these kinds of mushrooms and things like that, or whether it's actually a much more ancient thing that's part of a lot of organisms' biology overall. I'm not sure. I'm not an evolutionary biologist. Maybe this guy that thinks about volcanoes and the primordial soup and things all the time has some more insight there. But I think it's also clear that these molecules are ancient or older. Serotonin is, because beyond being a neurotransmitter, which roughly means a chemical messenger that functions in the space between two neurons, part of the nervous system, we know that serotonin can act as a hormone. It's released in the bloodstream from the gut. We also know that serotonin can bind intracellular receptors. So that's probably beyond thinking about neurotransmission or, I don't know, traditional anterograde neurotransmission anyway. And then we also have some information suggesting that serotonin can be transported into the cell nucleus, bind directly with DNA, and influence how it's expressed. So serotonylation and epigenetic modulation is part of what we know about serotonin now as well. So it was probably there at the beginning of the day, interacting with the different types of RNAs or bases that were part of the creation of the double helix. I don't know. I don't know how it all kind of happens, but it's fascinating to think about. And I think that the biology exists for a reason. And the psychedelics are fantastic neurobiologic probes that are going to teach us so much about this part of our spiritual biology that has been the black box and this oil and water mix between science and spirituality for a long period of time. So I'm really excited and think that it enhances the experiences because it essentially takes a scientific perspective and allows you to approach those questions with so much awe and wonder overall, which is, I think, is part of the mystical experience. Thinking about it without psychedelics feels pretty mystical to me at baseline. So contemplating it with a little bit of substance, I would say, has to enhance things overall.
Yeah. I really appreciate your, what is it, tagline? Spirit pharmacist, right? Typically, when people talk about psychedelics, if I talk to the scientific people, they typically talk about it in terms of molecules. These are the molecules that take X and Y happens, or sometimes they talk about it from a place of medicine. And then I talk to spiritual people, they talk about it for medicine and then sacrament, right? So you got molecule, you got medicine, you got sacrament. Very rarely I hear someone who is very well versed in the molecule sense, who also is speaking quite a lot. Look at your speaking patterns, a lot of spirituality. It's pretty rare, actually. I think you're the only person that I know who's well versed in the molecules who also speaking about spirituality so well. I'm curious, as someone who understands how the molecule works, when I speak to molecule people, they typically say, oh, okay, so I feel this particular way. I just want to feel this other way. I just take another maybe higher dose of this or mix thing with molecule B. And then I can play alchemist in my body to have a end result of euphoric
Yeah.
experience. How do you think about it as someone who is well versed in both worlds, right? Spirituality and molecules. Do you mess with the internal experience at all using up the doses or you change your thoughts internally? Like, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe you
Yeah.
can give it back to me what you think I'm asking before you answer the question. That'd be great.
Oh, yeah. I think what you're asking is a bit about how, what my essentially philosophical approach to psychedelic work is. It a little bit more around pharmacologism and symptomatic management in the realm of biological psychiatry, where it's take your meds in this sort of way and you will feel this sort of way at these other sorts of times. And that's a symptomatic reduction and functional improvement and maybe just the experience you want? Or is it a little bit more of, hey, we got to face all the darkness. We got to do psychedelic assisted therapy. We got to get to the absolute etiologic root of the illness, pull it like a weed for the garden, create a sustained long term remission where you're just going to be better for a long period of time. And, you know, some things might come up emotionally and things like that. But using psychedelics to spot your emotions or cope in some way is wrong or not the way we're supposed to be using them. Is that close?
Yeah, exactly. How do you think about the molecules, the
Yeah.
stories, the meaning behind it, and then maybe even the sacrament, the spiritual that's beyond even, that's transpersonal, that's coming from the outside? Love to hear your thoughts
Yeah.
about how you navigate all of this since you're the spirit pharmacist.
Well, I think spirit pharmacist, like you're kind of pointing out, it's not necessarily about a particular substance being the champion, and it's a little bit about the human themselves being the champion. Or I don't really know the road to mental well-being and happiness to every single person that I meet. I believe that that's something that I could be an expert sounding board as far as getting some reasonable plans together, things to try, ways to potentially move forward, but actually don't know what a human being is going to find that makes them happy. And I feel like that's a little bit of their own process or journey to kind of discover. And so when I'm working with persons, I'm usually trying to figure out what kind of person they are, what kind of language, what kind of things make them tick, and sort of like matching the way I'm talking about things or the energy to how they sort of perceive things in some way. And sometimes I would say that there's a level of misinformation where I'm trying to correct it with some kind of psychoeducation or something like that. But for example, drug, oh my God, that's a dirty word with so much baggage and negative connotation to it. So getting in with some psychedelic medicine facilitators that are using ayahuasca as the medicine, the spiritual sort of sacrament, and talking about DMT and harmala alkaloids as the drugs in ayahuasca. "Ugh, that's not a drug, it's medicine." And like all of a sudden our conversation's not going very far because I used a stigmatic term about drugs that carries a lot of baggage and just isn't the preferred way that they're sort of like thinking about it, like overall. So to me, drug is not a dirty word at all. It's just something that has a strong biological activity that lacks nutritional value and can't be classified as something else like a chemical toxin or a poison. That's all a
Love that.
drug really means to me as a pharmacist. It doesn't carry all of the stigmatic baggage that it does when I talk about drugs to the mother that lost a son to an opioid overdose. To her, drugs are just bad. And so talking about psychedelics like we're going to take a drug to help us in some way, all of a sudden I'm just bumping into their sort of mental resistance around the language that I'm using to talk about these things. Is it a type of person that has a lot of medical trauma overall, has gone on a psychiatric carousel for 10 or 20 years, is fed up with it in some ways, and they want more of a ritual, sacramental healing angle now. I'm going to be speaking in a specific way and thinking probably more about naturally occurring psychedelics and rituals for them. Some persons, my friend had a weird, wacky experience with a shaman. I want to heal, but I don't want any strange alternative kooky things going on at all. And God, I really love white coats, and I try some ketamine in an office setting, and we might talk about it more in the sense of a medicine or substance is one that I a lot because I find it to be one of the most neutral of terms overall. I still don't know if I'm really answering your question.
You are actually. I
Yeah.
really appreciate your attitude of meeting them where they're at. I think that's what I'm getting from this. But I actually wasn't so much asking about your professional do it. I was really more asking your personal.
Yeah.
How do you think about it as an expert, right? Who understands the molecule, the functional medicine aspect of it, who also is quite spiritual.
I think different, I know I'm like not making it about myself again, but I think different courses for different horses overall. And so, psychedelic assisted therapy with a guided support, it seems like those interventions have been studied and are probably well matched to psychological types of struggles like depression, anxiety, PTSD, those types of things. And it seems that there's something about those experiences that are acutely helpful for the person. Oftentimes, there is a rapid or a large symptom reduction that comes along with the session. But it also seems like it's something that they learn something about themselves. There's something actionable that they can take to move forward. And it seems that the results argue for this sort of sustained long-term remission. And persons have taken these results from these trials and come up with a narrative of psychedelics should be used for true healing and they should cure the problem at its root overall. And I like the narrative. I do think that psychedelic assisted therapy for those types of conditions probably goes a bit deeper and probably can get a lot closer to the etiologic root of illness and may be able to affect things that do create just sustained long-term sorts of benefits for the person. But if I got somebody that was using a small dose of psilocybin biweekly for management of cluster headaches or migraine headaches, I probably wouldn't be sitting down with them and talking about the integration work that they're not really doing. I probably wouldn't be sitting with a person that's using psychedelics for headache or migraine prophylaxis that they've found that some maybe miniature dose, on a biweekly basis keeps them well. It makes it so they don't have those types of horrible headaches anymore. The idea that psychedelics are purely for etiologic cure of psychiatric illness. It's like that's a piece of it. And it's a front running piece right now where the data is farther along than some of the other sorts of indications. But that doesn't mean that you cannot use psychedelics for prophylaxis, like prophylaxis of cluster or migraine headaches, for treatment, maybe of neurologic conditions, maybe for treatment of or of inflammatory types of conditions. So I think that it's actually really valid to think about use of psychedelic in maybe microdoses, maybe miniature doses on a semi-regular basis for symptomatic management of various types of conditions. And that might actually include psychiatric, can tend to get closer to an etiologic root of illness. So I really don't like the sort of psychedelics get to the etiology and cure you, and all the psychotropics just symptomatically manage. And if you're using a psychedelic and not making 100% headway and resolving the problem, then you're doing it wrong and you're not doing it right overall. And it's like, well, are we trying to use it for an inflammatory indication, for a neurologic indication, for a psychiatric kind of indication? What's your predisposition? How do you want to use these types of things overall? On the one hand, right, I'm trained as a clinical psychiatric pharmacist. I am, as you introduced me in the podcast, I well versed in the therapeutic use of psychedelics, and I really want persons to have safe and beneficial sorts of experiences. But using psychedelics as the treatment or cure for mental illness is pretty far from the say all end all be all of what psychedelics are or should be in my mind. I have really had a lot of wonderful, positive healing experiences with psychedelics in my life. But I would say that I've also been in the realm of psychonaut and just explorer of consciousness. And probably the principles that I really ascribe to and mean the most to me are actually principles of cognitive liberty. So Again, I want to be an expert sounding board. I don't want persons to do silly, unsafe, unreasonable types of things where they're just likely to get hurt or stung with psychedelics. But I'm also not going to take a person that maybe wants to use it for a more symptomatic management on a semi-regular basis and tell them that they're a bad person and that they're doing it wrong and they need to hire two guides and pay $10,000 immediately. Otherwise, there's nothing that's good that can happen. And frankly, that's a narrative I bump into regularly overall.
Yeah. So what I'm gathering from you is there's also not a one size fits all. Is for personalized
Yeah.
and
Like
really
like
what
I think
is
of like what is the point of psychedelics overall? If I had to boil it down, I would kind of say something along the lines of it's about self-exploration and it's finding that individual's own truth and then living that own truth to the highest degree that's possible for them. And part of that truth is going to be discovering which drugs, substances, medicines, or sacraments help you or keep you well or make you better, and what doses and what frequencies that you use that in. And we have some signposts out there, maybe from a little microdosing research or from the psychedelic assisted therapy trials, but they are more precedents that have been set by early research into this than they are the correct and only ways to use psychedelics with benefit. And so it's a big problem for evidence-based medicine overall because most of the evidence base we have is more of an evidence bias than an evidence base. It's the things that gets tested becomes the standards, but it doesn't mean that other things couldn't be helpful or beneficial or aren't worthy of testing, or that we wouldn't find that it works equally well or even better than some of the earlier sorts of front-running protocols and things like that. So it's obvious that the psychedelic assisted therapy protocol is a pretty good one. It works for a lot of persons. It's definitely not a bad model overall, but to sort of take that as a one size fits all model for using psychedelics and the standard that no one can deviate from, that's where I'm just going to say that sounds ludicrous.
yeah. No, I'm actually with you, by the way, in case you don't know.
Yeah, well, most persons are with me. I feel like the persons that are not with me are usually research from the ivory tower that have this sort of impression about psychedelics. If the public were to use this without two guides, then they would jump out of a window or something like that. And not to discount that there have been some tragic and bizarre things that have happened with psychedelics when persons don't safeguard their set and setting or maybe have predispositions that really raise the risks of psychedelic use and things like that. Like, I don't want to discount that there have been some really poor outcomes out there, but they are really few and far between overall. And the majority of adults can use a psychedelic safely and responsibly without doing those kinds of things. And there are several low-hanging fruit types of safeguards that persons can put in place that will further reduce risks of these types of adverse reactions. And so psychedelics should only be a prescription. I mean, that's prohibition light, and I'm not a prohibitionist, so I can't get on board with it.
I will also add, so there's the researchers, the policymakers who just wanted to govern in a very rigid, moralistic kind of way. But then there are also the indigenous spiritual conservatives who don't want people to mess with their traditions as well. But that's neither here or there. I'm actually curious because I'm actually going to be interviewing Jim Fetterman about microdosing. He is one of the OGs of the psychedelic world. So I'm really looking forward to that. But since you mentioned microdosing, from your perspective, do you have any strong philosophy around microdosing versus heroic dose versus regular dose in terms of?
I think a lot of the time I'm thinking and feeling that if you want to get into using psychedelics, you could start with some microdosing if you wanted to, but you should probably do yourself a favor and take a real psychoactive dose at some point in your exploration with them overall. So the idea of only using really low doses of psychedelics that never produce any level of psychedelic effect could be pretty helpful for some persons, but it seems like you're missing half the point of using a psychedelic a little bit to me to strictly focus on the realm of microdosing. I think for a few years there, 2020 to 2022, there was a big narrative that microdosing is totally a placebo and doesn't really do very much at all. And I think that we're finding more and more as the experiments advance, and we are allowed to do longer courses of microdosing in more naturalistic or home-based environments in persons that actually have some level of depression or anxiety. We're finding that it works better overall. It seems that LSD seems to raise mood a lot more in depressed people than it does in persons that are not depressed, if you're thinking about those microdosings of ranges. Wrongly, it was concluded that microdosing can't beat placebo or is a placebo early in the game. And as the experimental data gets more into that phase 2 zone, where we're out of the realm of healthy volunteers and we're actually testing a real course of microdosing in a person that has some psychiatric symptoms, it seems like the data is improving or getting stronger overall. I think another part of the microdosing research has been that when a person does feel better or notice improvements, it's typically limited to the day of microdosing. That's also been challenged a little bit recently. There's one experiment now showing that the day after an LSD microdose, a person tends to get about 20 minutes more sleep that night. And it's not because they increased their physical activity that day. It seems like they were able to go to bed earlier and slept a little bit longer. 20 minutes is the threshold for a clinically significant improvement in sleep overall in sleep research. So it feels a little bit miniature high for the day, and that's a bit blasphemous. It's big for the world of microdosing to talk about it in that way. And I think sometimes persons are you're doing this course of microdosing, and if it's really miniature high for the day, then the next day you're going to wake up, you're going to be in the same place that you were, or the course of microdosing ends and you regress back to your baseline in a relatively short period of time. And that may not be true for everyone. A person might do a course of microdosing, work on their diet or lifestyle, set some intentional goals, address some other things, and they may actually feel quite a bit better for a long period of time after a course of microdosing. But even if it was true, I feel like our expectations are too high. Like, are we really expecting a course of microdosing to do the same thing as psychedelic assisted therapy and get these sustained long-term types of improvements? Or maybe we should look at microdosing a little bit more akin to traditional medication taking, with your Xanax. If you stop using Xanax, does your anxiety stay down? Or does it quickly go back and maybe even rebound higher than it was previously? Basically all acute psychoactive things sort of function this way. Weight loss drugs. If you stop your weight loss drug, do you maintain the lower weight, or you typically gain some of the weight back? Your blood pressure drugs. When you stop your blood pressure drugs, does your hypertension just stay well controlled, or may the blood pressure increase again? Right. So it's mostly the nature of substance overall that the effects are limited to the times of intoxication or the times that you're using the substances. That's actually the standard. Psychedelic assisted therapy is the freak example that seems to break away from that. So then to take microdosing and have the same expectations of that, it seems a little bit apples and oranges to me. And maybe we just shouldn't have those same sorts of thoughts about microdosing. And maybe that's not ultimately what the goal of microdosing really should be. Maybe it really should be a more day-to-day symptomatic, maybe even spot a mood. I said it type of thing, right? Because the only drugs that we're allowed to use as needed in psychiatry are ones that have acute psychoactive effects that rapidly change symptoms. You're never going to use an SSRI to PRN manage depression or anxiety because it can't work that way. You have to take it consistently on a daily basis for a period of time to produce a neuroadaptive response. Only acutely psychoactive things can be used PRN. Psychedelics are acutely psychoactive things. The difference between psilocybin or LSD and all those other acutely psychoactive things like benzos, stimulants, opioids, is that they don't have the same sort of reinforcing or addictive hook to them. So I think that there's room for microdosing to consider not only regimens where persons are doing it weekly, maybe every other day, some of the Stamets protocols, 4 or 5 days on, a few days off, that kind of thing. Or it might be PRN perfect Sunday. I don't microdose regularly. Today's a nice day. I'm going to go to the beach, do some self-care activities, do some gardening, whatever my feel-good hobbies are. Maybe I want to take some time and space for myself because it's just been a pretty tough week overall. And I feel like there's some things I could reflect on, or I feel like there's some emotions kind of bottled. Go for a walk, do some stretching, take a meditation. Maybe I'll take a microdose. Maybe I'll actually bump it up into the sort of miniature dose range at that point. I won't be driving a car or operating an 18-wheeler on the way to my family reunion if I choose to do those types of things, right? I'm going to take some playbooks out of the psychedelic assisted therapy and start safeguarding my time, my set and setting, things like that, if I'm really going to push it outside the microdosing range. But I think what I'm getting at is that there's a whole lot of room for different doses at different times and different sorts of patterns that might just be the answer for some persons. And again, you have these like science microdosing and the psychedelic assisted therapy, but there's a whole lot of room in between that is yet to be sort of truly explored. I think it's really valid to explore, think about as ways that we could use these things.
I like that. Maybe we can get the Malcolm protocol started.
Well, it's the PRN Perfect Sunday. That's the Spirit Pharmacist microdosing protocol
like
as
that.
is. And yeah, exactly. In the spirit of just making up a little microdosing regimen and then coining it with my name. That's what
I like that.
Spirit Pharmacist PRN Perfect Sunday. Yeah.
Perfect. One aspect I'm particularly interested in is neurogenesis, because I'm a high functioning person, and luckily that way.
Yeah.
I'm very blessed. So, but I'm interested in reinforcing perhaps learning and cognitive ability using these type of protocols, whether it's microdose or heroic dose. That's the way I'm thinking about my own personal experience, right? These are tools
Yeah.
of refinement for me. So I wonder
Yeah.
if you have any suggestions on protocols or books or resources for me to study, think about, look at.
Well, I think the neuroplastic window after using a psychedelic seems to open as the effects of the substance are dissipating. And I think it strongly persists for 48 or 72 hours afterwards, probably up to a week, and maybe in some ways like up to a month. So I think a lot of the time, if a person has changes that they know they want to make, being like boots on the ground and making those kinds of lifestyle changes even before the experience, I think is great, right? Like priming the pump a little bit. But I think maintaining the differences is a little bit different afterwards. I think it takes about 3 weeks of doing something different to entrain a new habit. So I do think that psychedelic experiences can be really nice springboards for habitual changes or habitual shifts, and you're utilizing the neuroplasticity that way. I think on the flip side of that, you probably want to safeguard yourself during that period of time against things that you feel might be detrimental to your biology. So, for example, you may want to avoid binge watching Netflix shows about psychopaths and serial killers for the 48 or 72 hours afterwards. If you know that's just one of your time wasters that sucks you in, but then usually makes you feel like crap afterwards, really take you in the direction in life that you want to go in. Right. So there's a few ways to get a hot air balloon off the ground. One is to pump more hot air into it, and the other way is to cut the lead weights that are holding it down. And so thinking about neuroplasticity as both of them, maybe the neuroplasticity is the hot air. It's the motivation for change. It's the things that fills my sails, but also need to be cognizant of the things that are not filling my sails, that are weighing me down in some ways, and avoiding them permanently would be nice, but specifically during the neuroplastic window where I think we're making maybe a more of a conscious effort to change overall. I don't think that was truly your question though, because I think I answered it on the basis of neuroplasticity as far as a catalyst for change or transformation. But I think that your question was almost along the lines of high functioning neurohacking rather than fixing a problem or changing some aspect of my life that is less than ideal or maladaptive as far as a coping mechanism in some ways. I don't really know what the answers are. I would say because right now our experience with psychedelics are truly limited to that realm of pathology, right? They're not limited to, like, we have the phase 1 experiments in the healthy volunteers, but those phase 1 experiments, all they're trying to demonstrate is that the persons took this, it was safe, it was tolerable. There's no efficacy measures mentioned. There's no, well, did your pretty good life get even better afterwards? So that's like not even part of the questions from phase 1 trials with healthy volunteers. Some of the phase 2 trials, right? Or there is a trial with ketamine out there that essentially has a person do a brain training program for a few days afterwards. So there's a group that gets a ketamine infusion and they do kind of like a sham training program. And then there's a group that does a ketamine infusion and they do, I forget the name of the training program, but it's essentially, it sort of reinforces a different identity of self, like worthy, loving. And it sort of shows pictures of themselves smiling, alternating with pictures of strangers smiling. And the person did this intervention, took like 15 or 20 minutes twice a day for 3 days afterwards. And it extended the characteristic antidepressant effect of ketamine from the 3 to 7 days, which is normal with a single infusion, to 30 days. 30 days later, they still didn't have those depressive symptoms come back. So I'm excited about this. And I don't necessarily know what all the answers are, but I believe that there's so much that we can do in those 72 hours afterwards as far as behavioral training with the person that is not talking with a therapist and reading the psychedelic tea leaves and trying to put something symbolic together from the experience, not to discount that or to say that that's not an important aspect to engage with as well, perhaps, but there's probably a whole lot more that can be done as far as, right, I want to learn a new language. Is learning easier in the 72 hours afterwards if I use a special type of learning technique or encounter materials in some way? Will it just osmotically get into my brain a bit better or a bit faster? I think that
Yeah,
there's probably, maybe you probably are familiar with the book Stealing Fire
sure.
by yeah. So
Fowler. Yeah.
they talk a lot in that book about how, and they do talk about psychedelics in that book a bit, but they use flow states and surfing as one of their bigger examples, and they essentially point to some emerging bodies of consciousness research that suggests that if you can reach one of these flow states, then your creativity is boosted 300 to 500%. Right. So it seems like accessing some of these special mental states also just opens up an ability to have improved cognitive faculties or creative faculties in some ways. And that, exactly, have we done the experiment that shows the psychedelic state really boosts these sorts of aspects the same way that flow and surfing? Maybe not, but I think that there is something about the non-ordinary state. I mean, it almost goes, I think, to what you mentioned a little bit earlier as far as psychedelic assisted innovation. This is about thinking about problems in a new light, getting outside this typical way that we approach things and, right, taking some of the limits off of our thoughts and allowing new ideas to kind of percolate or come in. So that actually seems really close to that sort of hacking angle rather than fixing pathology. And I think we have a lot of natural examples with Steve Jobs, and I forget who invented the polymerase chain reaction that essentially amplified DNA and allowed us to essentially create infinite amounts and copies of the same tiny little DNA fragments. That was an LSD idea that the guy
Mm.
had at times. So we have all of these examples through music, art, science, of essentially psychedelic inspired creativity or innovation that, where would our society be without Pink Floyd,
Mm.
without Steve Jobs, without polymerase chain reaction? Where would we be truly? Maybe someone else would have thought of it naturally without a psychedelic a couple of years later and we'd have all the same things, but I kind of doubt it.
Yeah.
And
I
that's
mean,
in the context of it's stigmatized, illegal, and nobody's even allowed to do it. Imagine what would happen to our society if we were allowed to safely access these things and persons did on a relatively wide scale basis. Where could we be as far as kindness, as far as empathy, as far as our level of function, as far as our level of pathology, as far as our level of not being this capitalistic alpha predator that thinks the planet is something to ruin, run over, and plunder, but to be a ecological steward of biodiversity that prioritizes the well-being of all life? I mean, do I think psychedelics can save the world is like almost where we're going to. And it almost seems silly to think that psychedelic ingestion in of itself is going to. But I see this kind of psychedelic renaissance as an incredibly key part of a larger renaissance in humanity that's sort of bringing us back to our true selves and the place that we are meant to occupy on the planet instead of the place that we're trying to occupy that obviously is not working.
yeah. Thanks for sharing those thoughts. I'm an optimist as well. Um,
Yeah. Like we can
well,
do it, it's not too late. Like we have
yeah,
the chance to change right now, and we have a neuroplastic tool that can awaken and catalyze transformation. It's got to be a part of it. Like it can't be the only solution. That's a little too far, but it's got to
yeah.
play a role. It has to be a part of it.
It's one tool. Well, you're a
Yeah.
musician, right? And anecdotally, you've seen and heard people have, learn new songs and new instruments, and musicians love drinking ayahuasca and play music, anecdotally learn things faster. So using visualization, affirmation, these type of tools afterwards or
Yeah.
beforehand is very helpful to reinforce some of these neural connections.
Yeah.
Hence why I was curious to ask you that question.
Maybe it's less about the psychedelic enhances my ability to learn a new skill set, like playing an instrument. And I would say what I've noticed about ayahuasca and ceremony and ayahuasca and music is really that probably more than giving a person a superpower to learn a new instrument, it breaks their limiting belief that they're not a musician and I can't sing. And, so many people are walking around thinking, I'm not a musician. I don't sing songs. So I can't sing in ceremony or I've never played an instrument before. So the idea of picking up a Native American flute and learning how to do it, I mean, I can't do that. Right. So people are walking around with these narratives in their head. I can't do that because I've never done that and I'm not a singer and I'm not a musician. And then they get into ceremony and it sort of works on them a little bit and they break some things down. And at some point, they like one of the songs and learn it. Or whether you're up, would you like to contribute a song? Oh, I don't know. I've never done that before. And then they do it and it's beautiful and it moves people. And they say something in the integration circle about how your song, the nervousness that you had around it, the fact that it wasn't quite perfect, some little note broke at some point, that made it so human and it catalyzed my own healing. And then people hear these sorts of things and they start to think, well, it was completely crazy to think that a person with a voice can't sing. What a nutty narrative that I can't sing a song. I have a voice, it comes out of my mouth, it makes a sound. I can sing a song. I think some of it might be enhancing learning and some of it might be shifting limiting beliefs and stories that we've had about ourselves and what we are and aren't for a long time.
Yeah. Well, I was definitely one of those person.
Yeah,
Uh,
I mean, I've seen it over and over again. I would say 50% of the people that drink ayahuasca regularly end up singing or playing an instrument that they didn't do before they started drinking ayahuasca. I would love to see some numbers on it, but it's shockingly high, like the percentages. Yeah.
yeah, I can testify. For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any specific practices as a way to help you maybe reinforce certain ideas or beliefs or manifestation of any source after ceremony so then you can concretize that vision into real life?
Not particularly. Really
Mm.
just depends what the vision was and whether it's an immediately implementable thing or whether it's part of the other 100 great manic ideas I have that need to be done in 3 years from now. Because now it's a good idea, it's just not a good time to do it, right? So there's a lot of those types of things. I don't know, I say I'm a habitual psychedelic user. It's somewhere between habit and ritual, right? It's semi-regular, and it's usually the prompts that I usually come with is what's happened in the last week or few that maybe I need to revisit that situation because I think that I made an error. Maybe I didn't act with my emotions in the way that I would want myself to be able to. Right. So there's a little bit of review, but it's typically centered upon the immediate past rather than a remote or distant past or growing up or childhood. But that's part of just the evolution of a psychedelic user. Some of my earlier experiences really were about those sorts of times in life, but not so much anymore. Occasionally things come to me. I'm more than willing to think about it. I actually really enjoy going back to those types of places. I just don't find that the psychedelic takes me there too often anymore overall. And then I start thinking about, okay, what about the next week or few and what things are not done now that I want to have done in those periods of time. So it's a bit of, I would say, let's review the immediate past for missed opportunities or things that I would like to replay and do better, or maybe emotionally process something if there is something that was aggravating or whatever. And then
Mm.
kind of looking forward now, what are the things that I just need to do to move my life or business forward?
Yeah.
And I find that if I do those things, the next time I use a psychedelic, there's a little bit of a, oh, good boy, here's some more homework kind of. And if I don't do those things, a little bit of, you didn't do those things and they're still outstanding things. And you were told that you were supposed to do them last time and you still haven't done them. And I don't necessarily
Yeah.
get slapped across the face and hurt and things, but I get a gentle reminder that if you want to move up in the video game, you have to beat the current level's boss. You can't
Yeah.
just bypass Bowser and get to the next level by
Yeah.
pretending Bowser is not the end boss that is sitting there waiting to be beaten. You kind of just have
Yeah.
to do that to get to the next rung of whatever conscious states that these things can, yeah, elicit
Yeah.
in persons. Yeah.
I like that. Tool of refinement, just the way I think about it as well. What about doses? When you think about, again, right, since you're quite familiar with
Yeah.
doses and in interaction, and the impact of it, how do you personally think about doses whenever you go into a journey ceremony?
Well, if it's one of these, I would say semi-regular, have ritual sorts of home things that I'm doing, the doses are relatively low. I'm looking
Mm,
to on the lower side of moderate overall, because I just don't really need to get that deep to have this sort of effect and go through these types of things. And I really
mm,
don't want to have experiences that feel overwhelming or too much in a solo type of environment. Whereas if
mm,
I'm going to some kind of guided ritual retreat for the weekend, or I know that I'm going to have supervision there, I'm typically want to push it into that moderate or large dose place. And
mm,
like I just mentioned the possibility of being overwhelmed, and I think that is something that you have to worry about a little bit. Less than being overwhelmed, I don't use large doses at home by myself because it's not that I'm afraid from a safety angle. It's just that when you have something big happen to you with a psychedelic, usually associated with a larger or bigger kind of dose, you just want to witness there. Like
mhm,
it, and so it's less about I don't use large doses because I'm afraid something bad will happen or that there's a big safety risk for me. I actually feel like I can navigate the state fairly well overall. But I don't know, maybe there is a chance that I can't, right? I don't want to have so much hubris in all of it. And
mhm,
then that's a pitfall in the psychedelic world to have a lot of pride or hubris or think that you can
mhm,
handle any dose at any time. Like you can't, right? And that is an invitation for your ego to get flattened. And maybe you need that lesson in humility, but maybe you've already learned that lesson and you just don't need to do it again thing. But the idea of having a witness there when something really major kind of happens, it makes it more real. It solidifies it. And I think it really increases the chances that you're going to take it to heart and do something with it. Whereas, I don't know, if you're me, your mind can be pretty slippery sometimes, and maybe it sees something or feels something or realizes something. And without the witness there is trying to backpedal out of it 3 or 4 days later or something like that, or kind of play down just how big or impactful it was. And you don't want that. Right.
yeah,
So yeah, if it's a guided supervised community thing, I'm generally wanting to go a little bit higher and a little bit deeper because it's safer too. And if something big happens, there'll be plenty of witness there. And when it's a little bit more of, ooh, I just want to clear some things from the previous week or two and sort of plan my next week or two. And it's more like I was moving the chains forward in my life types of things, like low, maybe
yeah.
lower end of moderate is kind of like the dosing ranges.
This is a smile of recognition, by the way. All the things that you mentioned, all the mistakes, the heuristic.
Yeah.
I get it. I understand. Yeah. What about you hear these new concoctions and people are like Ayahuasca and then Ayahuasca plus psilocybin mushrooms and then this concoction, that concoction. As a spirit pharmacist, what's your attitude around that? Or are you more like, "Ooh,
I
let's
mean, the
try that?"
psychonaut in me thinks it's super cool. I think that there is room for a whole lot of innovation in the psychedelic world as far as the types of things we do, the protocols that are there, etc. And a lot of times I'm thinking if you're a guide, if you're doing psychedelic assisted therapy with persons, and particularly, they have some illnesses and things like that, you probably want to stick with the things that are a little bit more tried and true. Your MDMA, your psilocybin, LSD, ketamine, ayahuasca. You probably want to not get super experimental with your cathinone related research compounds and things like that because there's less evidence there. If something really goes wrong, why were we using that compound or substance? And sometimes I get what I think are not great rationales like, oh, well, they're taking this drug, which is contraindicated with MDMA. We don't know anything about this other designer cathinone, so maybe combining will be fine. I would actually much rather take a known risk with a tried and true sort of substance that's been around for decades, if not millions or thousands of years overall, than something that was invented in a lab like 10 or 15 years ago. And we don't have much, health or safety information. Are those experiences cool? Is it cool to try a new thing? It absolutely is. Am I open to trying new things? I absolutely am. but I'm not going to be trying new things on my clients.
Hmm.
Who am I and what's my level of experience and what am I okay with and what would I be willing to do for my sick mother, right?
Hmm.
What would I be willing to do for this person that I don't know, maybe I screen them and they seem a good candidate, but frankly, I don't really know them very well. And we also don't know very much about this compound overall. I like to, heaven forbid that we get to this place, but I always do approach it as far as like, okay, whether it was a legal compound or not, what would be my rationale if I had to get on a stand in front of a jury and explain to them why I picked that dose and that particular substance for that particular person? And as long as I could come up with a rationale that seems consistent with a clinical line of evidence that has shown benefit and been reasonably safe, I don't know if that safeguards me against any kind of conviction, but it probably safeguards me against whoever is on that jury from thinking that I was really trying to do something reckless or haphazard or that I didn't have a positive intention for the person overall. And whatever I did do, somebody could also come along and say, yeah, that's exactly what they have been doing. And it's worked really well for a lot of people. Whereas if I start using funky high doses of obscure substances, then it's a lot harder to concoct a good rationale about why do we do that at the end of the day.
I really appreciate how you think about all this, Ben. Thank you so much. Are there questions that you think I should be asking you, but I didn't ask you in our conversation so far?
No, not really. I think I would end by saying that you can find me at spiritpharmacist.com. I do psychopharmacology consulting, so lots of one-to-one individual work, help with preparation screening around journeys for different types of guides, facilitators, retreat center organizations, clinicians, integration coaches, but then I also have psychedelic education. So I do different courses. I really focus on psychedelic pharmacology a lot more than like how to conduct psychedelic assisted therapy and things of that nature. So if you enjoyed this podcast, I really would encourage you to head over to spiritpharmacist.com. Join my email list is a really great way of staying in touch with the types of offers and things that I have going on. Yeah, I think that wraps it up as far as I don't know, I really liked all your questions and
Thank
I
you.
like that we started with didgeridoo and not drug interaction. It's good.
That's a new,
Yeah.
different kind of podcast starter, right? So, Ben,
Yeah.
let me just take a moment to acknowledge you. I really appreciate your thoughtfulness in really humanized how people think about these type of drug, medicine, sacrament interactions is really about the persons, not just about these compounds interacting with each other and the body and so forth. And really appreciate the empathy that you put in all the thoughtfulness that you put in before you answer any of my questions. First, thank you so much for being here on Noble Warrior.
Thanks for having me, CK. And it's been a real pleasure. And I can't wait to listen to the podcast.